In the last class, we looked into the dramatic increases in living standards that were observed in the last 200 years. We finished by noting that such increases didn't affect everyone in the same way when we look at the data since 1970s. Inequality was decreasing between countries, but not within countries, in particular in developed economies. This is precisely what these plots show, now focusing on the period between 1988 to 2008. In the upper left plot, you see the growth in GDP by the percentile of the global income distribution. We see very large increases in the top tail and in the bottom 70%, but not the 75th to the 95th percentile didn't seem to reap much from the global growth in income. The people in this group are precisely the blue-collar middle class of developed economies, who since the 1980s have been losing social and relative economic status. Now focusing on the US income distribution, since it is typically the country for which there is better data availability, between 1973 and 2012, the income share of the top 1% rose from 7.74% of all income to close to 20%, its highest value since recorded history up to then. If we go back to the beginning of the course and how to think about GDP, we mentioned how it sums up to all income paid to the entities that took part in the production process. Although this is far from being an undisputed fact, there is plenty of literature that shows that the labor share, the amount of income that goes to workers, has been declining. The wage series certainly suggests that, as we see it declining from about 2/3 to closer to a bit over 1/2. Corporate profits, on the other hand, have increased and are at its highest value since the 1950s, at least. At the same time, we witnessed the shrinking of the middle class. In 1979, about 56.5% of households in the US, ages 25 to 64, had earnings within 50% of the median income. By 2012, this had decreased to 45.1%. Historically, we have seen that technological progress led to innovations that would augment labor productivity and increase the median wages. This virtuous cycle, for the US at least, seemed to have somehow stopped in the 1970s. Since then, labor productivity kept rising, but median hourly compensation for work hardly improved. What we do see are dramatic increases in top wages, especially at the top 1%, which have increased about 138% since 1980, and the bottom 90% showing very modest increases in wages. Look at the median wage of a CEO. In 1970s, they were about 20 times the wage of the median employee. Today, they are close to 300, after a fall from almost 400 following the burst of the dot-com bubble. So how do you think this makes people feel? I would say that there are a lot of people, working middle classes in developed economies, who are very frustrated with how their living standards play out in the last 30 to 40 years. A whole generation of middle-class blue-collar workers who entered the labor markets in the 1980s. It is not so much that their living standards decreased in absolute terms, but they have missed on much of the economic growth since then. So what kind of social impact would we expect from these economic trends in inequality? To think a bit about it, let's see the following experiment. These are two monkeys in cages side by side. They have been trained to work in the sense that they are given a task which upon completion gives a reward in the form of a piece of a cucumber. This task consists in receiving a stone from one hole and giving it back through another hole. Both monkeys were very happy to perform this task several times before. However, now we'll introduce some form of inequality. The monkey in the left will still be receiving cucumber, but the monkey in the right will get grapes, which are sweeter. Let's see what happens. As we can see, the monkey was not happy. There's a lot to say about this experiment, but what I want to take from it is that there is a case to be made about the idea that increasing inequality can fuel resentment and anti-establishment sentiment. We'll now look at one specific event in the last decade that caught most analysts off guard. We will look at the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump that took place in 2016. We'll decompose the votes by demographic group in an attempt to understand what happened. But first, it is important to say that the analysis will be made in terms of changes relative to the Obama versus Romney election, not in levels. We know that African Americans vote overwhelmingly Democrat, regardless of the candidate have done so for a long time. It is not so much about who wins the African American vote as it is about how much did they change their vote. On the other hand, most of the Bible Belt, more rural and less diverse states, vote overwhelmingly Republican, again, regardless of the candidate. While the electoral system in the US is a winner-grabs-it-all votes by state, with a couple of exceptions, we will look at changes in voting testimonies as a basis for our analysis. So when I just said that voting in the US is heavily polarized, I meant it. This is such an example. In the last election in North Dakota, David Andal, who was running for the state legislature, was voted into office even though he had died from COVID-19 complications about a month before the election. For you to realize just how much of a surprise was Trump's election against Hillary, let's just look at the New York Times predictions of who would win the election between the midnight after the voting booths closed and the morning. Everyone was expecting a robust win by Hillary to the last minute. But as the votes started being counted through the night, it became more and more obvious that Hillary would not become the first female president of the US. So what happened? Donald Trump ran a campaign on decreasing taxes to the rich and cutting entitlements, such as Medicaid and Medicare, to the poor. However, as we can see here, it was precisely in the lowest income groups that Donald Trump managed to increase his vote count the most. At face value, it is hard to reconcile this with the tone of his campaign. When we break it down by education, what we see is that voters that mostly switched Republican were not just poorer, but also less educated. Looking along gender lines, men were the ones who switched the most to Republican. Finally, crossing ethnicity and education, we start to see a picture that suggests that the vote of less educated white males was one of the key determinants of the outcome of that election. What about minorities? On June 16, 2015, Donald Trump made these statements that had wide coverage in the media.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Other remarks with respect to other ethnic groups were not well received either. However, all minorities increased their vote share towards Republicans relative to the previous election. So, how can we make sense of all of this? Well, first we can start by recognizing that there was a strong aversion to Hillary Clinton. As we can see, about 51% of Republicans openly disliked Hillary, even though only 39% of Democrats would say the same about Donald Trump. Even though Hillary was arguably the most well-prepared first mandate presidential candidate in the history of the US, was former senator, secretary of state, first lady, governor, and so forth, precisely because of her experience, she was also the face of the political establishment of the previous 30 years. Precisely the establishment that failed to promote inclusive growth and that generated the trends in inequality we saw before. That generated resentment and fueled the anti-establishment vote along large proportions of the population. Trump, on the other hand, was the anti-establishment candidate that perfectly incarnated that resentment. Just a couple of weeks ahead of the general election, Trump specifically said that he would put Hillary in jail if he got elected, in the context of investigation regarding Hillary using her personal mobile phone to access official emails from her Secretary of State email account.
She deleted the emails. She has to go to jail.
Trump often mentioned that he wanted to get elected so he could drain the swamp that was Washington, D.C. Lastly, with respect to minorities, they tend to be poorer and probably more susceptible to anti-establishment sentiment and/or more threatened by illegal immigration. It is good to remember that only immigrants that have acquired the US citizenship are allowed to vote, a process that often takes many years. This kind of dynamics is not exclusive to the US. In a recent article by Funk and co-authors, one can see that populist governments have surged since the early 1980s and have never been in fact so popular. But this has consequences. And what the authors show is that populist governments tend to lead to slower economic growth of about 1% per year. This is due to policies that are typically adopted by such governments, such as protectionism, unsustainable macroeconomic policies like trade and government deficits, and the deterioration of institutions. They also show that there ain't much difference in terms of left or right populism. Is it fair, though, to classify Trump's election in this manner? It might be too soon yet to have a definitive say. Some indicators are consistent with the idea that he did pursue some macroeconomic policies that are unsustainable in the long run. The government budget deficit continuously deteriorated, but it did not reach levels comparable to what happened in the Great Recession. Unemployment did decrease significantly during his mandate, and even income growth of the bottom 25% was higher than the top 25%. However, there is little doubt regarding the adoption of protectionist policies, both at the practical and rhetorical level. Trump started trade wars with Mexico, Canada, China, and Europe. During his presidency, the value of foreign direct investment fell significantly, all consistent with the America First campaign motto. But going back to the rise of populism, its increase in the 1980s has been associated with the process of globalization. Technological improvements, in particular at the level of transportation, information, and communication technologies, led to an unprecedented integration of world economies. All of a sudden, workers in developed economies, especially blue-collar workers, were facing competition from much cheaper labor from Southeast Asia, for example. At the same time, this greater integration led to a much higher degree of business dynamism and the ability to quickly adapt to a changing economic environment. A new paradigm built on differentiation, innovation, creativity, and supported by technological competence was now dominant. With it, also rose the possibility of economies of scale being ever more a dominant factor and market concentration increased. Big multinationals started to dominate markets as never before. And as an example, all the brands of food products that you see here belong to just a few conglomerates. This process allowed many economies to catch up with their richer counterparts, but it also gave rise to, as we saw before, increases within country inequality, especially in Western democracies, fueling anti-establishment sentiment and populism, and threatening the social sustainability of the current economic paradigm. I would say that one of the biggest challenges, if not the biggest, of our generation is precisely to maintain social cohesion in the age of globalization. As technology and globalization threaten undifferentiated labor, returns to labor decrease, capital is increasingly harder to tax, and population age. Maintaining social cohesion is an enormous challenge, made harder only by inefficient governments which are heavily indebted and with little resources to attack the issue at hand, vulnerable to the populist threat. If this model is to survive, we need to gather the best about globalization and technology improvements, their competitive discipline, the freedom it provides from repetitive and dangerous work, as these tasks are increasingly automated, and the potential welfare gains it brings, and make sure we do not leave anyone behind in the process. Not just because you might be prone to think it is the right thing to do, but also because it may well be the only way to go forward in democracy.